Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming along to listen. It's been emotional. So, as marketers, as advertisers, as managers, as friends, colleagues, parents, pretty much anything that we do in our day-to-day lives, either at work or at home, a lot of the time we're trying to really get people to make particular decisions. We're trying to influence and persuade people in particular ways in order to take outcomes and make decisions that we think will be beneficial. And while a lot of us do that, in fact, all of us do that to some degree, day in, day out, not many people actually take the time to think about how these decisions are made. And it turns out that, as with many things in life, this is completely studyable and understandable, and psychologists have gone a long way to understanding how people make these decisions and what the triggers are for them. So what I want to do this morning is to take you through how this plays out in B2B, because without wishing to jump ahead too far, there is a preconception that B2B is less emotional than B2C, and I would like to gently challenge that for you this morning and see how I can get on with that. So, there we go. So, start with a quote. Most of us think of ourselves as thinking creatures that feel, but we are actually feeling creatures that think. And my background is in engineering and computer software and programming and all those kinds of interesting things. And when I first read this, I was vehemently in disagreement with it. I didn't like the idea that fundamentally my actions and my thoughts were governed by feelings rather than logic, because logic was what I did and what I still do to a degree. But I think that over time, predictably, otherwise I wouldn't be standing up here giving this talk. My view on this has changed, and I do agree that we are feeling creatures that think. And let's see how we get on with convincing you this morning as well. Incidentally, Jill Taylor, the lady who is this quote, is really fascinating. So she's a neuroanatomist, which I'm still not entirely sure what that does. But she's an amazing lady who you should really follow on Twitter and stuff. Really interesting if you're interested in psychology. I want to start with a show of hands, and this is really interesting because there's different results for this depending on the audience. So just quickly to get us kicked off, who would say that predominantly they make their business decisions based on cold, hard facts? Like, can we put our hands up? Okay, a few people. And who would say that they're predominantly based on more emotional factors? Okay, so we have a very enlightened room. So I will be reconfirming your prejudices today for the most part rather than challenging them. But the thing that I would say is interesting there is that I asked that question at quite a few different talks, and particularly when I ask it at kind of, how can I put it, more like finance-led areas, like bankers and things like that, a lot more people say it's completely rational. And it's really interesting because I've kind of got into not arguments because I'm not argumentative, with people before a talk. And then I've done the talk and they've come over and they've said, actually, you changed my mind a bit. So that's kind of a win. Let's see if I can do that today. So to start with a couple of facts. So people have researched this, as you can imagine. This is a survey done back, I think, in 2009 by CEB, which is now part of Gartner. And what they did is they asked people, 3,000 people, to rank different B2B brands in terms of the value that they believed that they would offer to their business, right? So 3,000 people, I think it was about 32 different brands, scale of 1 to 10. How much do you think they're going to help your business from a business value perspective? And what they found was that across those 32 different brands, the lowest average score that was received was about a 6.5 out of 10, and the highest was about a 7.5. So there's a very thin line there of differentiation in terms of perceived business value. And when you stop and when you think about that, that actually makes an awful lot of sense, because who can really say with a complex B2B offering that they can see ahead of time all of the different points of potential value, all the different potential risks? Nothing's going to be a 10 unless you've worked with that company before. But equally, if it's a supplier and it's on a list, then it's up for consideration. It's probably going to offer some business value. So there's this very thin line in terms of perceptions of the business value that a particular supplier can bring. A second point from a similar study, again by CEB, surveying 9,000 people. Only 14% said that they saw real differences between suppliers and that they would value that difference enough to pay for it. So the vast majority of people say that they don't see difference, and if you don't see difference, then you're not going to be prepared to pay for it. So again, those two stats are just, there's dozens of stats like this from this report and from other similar reports, but what it really shows is that there's just not enough differentiation on business value for us to be making these decisions that we need to make. So the question then becomes, how do we make these decisions? And this is where it becomes really interesting, at least from my perspective. So if we're not making it based on facts, then how are we making these decisions? Let's have a look. So who remembers this dress? Hopefully everyone, come on, help me out. Everyone remembers this dress, okay, good. So this was a famous dress. well, famous dress, why not? About, I think, 4 or 5 years ago on social media. And what happened for anyone who was living under a rock at the time, someone took this picture in the middle of this dress and I completely, by accident, put it on social media. And some people said, hey, that's a really nice blue and black dress. And other people said, no, 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 it's a nice white and gold dress. And this was all over the media, all over the news. And the interesting thing was that if you saw it as blue and black, even if you had been told that it was actually white and gold, or if you saw it as white and gold, then actually not a problem. But if you saw it as blue and black, even though you knew it was white and gold because you've been shown the dress maybe in real life or there've been other news stories about it, you still couldn't force your brain to believe that it was gold and white. So something really interesting is happening there, which is our first little insight into decision making and how the brain works, which is that the rational part of your brain knows that the dress is white and gold, but you still see it as blue and black, which is a really interesting thing to observe. And we're going to have a look at a few more examples of this now. So if we could have a look at the first slide here. So on the left, if we can zoom in on that, please. Thank you very much. There are 2 panels here marked A and B. So sorry, this is more interactive than I expected. How many people think that A and B are different colors, those 2 patterns on the grid? There we go. Everyone, because we're all human. Fantastic. And then if we close this down, please, and just watch the video. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to take this away. If we can just pause when we get to the end, please, because otherwise it jumps off. There we go. Fantastic. Good timing. So how many people now believe that A and B, I lost it. How many people at the end there believe that A and B are the same color? It went quite quickly. Maybe we can do that again so people can. Do we need to do it again? They're the same color? Okay, just one more. Pardon?
What about the font or the square?
Sorry, the square itself. So the color of the background, A, and the background here, B. Yeah? How many people can see when we get to the end of the video that these 2 things are the same color? Yeah.
Exactly the same colour. The B is a bit lighter, isn't it?
Okay. If you get your color dropper out and you pick the hex codes, they're actually identical.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. I can send this afterwards so you can verify that. Don't trust me. So they are in fact exactly the same color, right? But then if we go back to the original diagram, sorry, I'm making the poor guy at the back really work for his here. Like, how many people can really convince their brain that these are the same color, even though we've just demonstrated that? It's not possible, right? So we're seeing again the fact that there's 2 parts of your brain is what we're seeing. There's the part of your brain that assesses things rationally, and there's the part of your brain that kind of does whatever the hell it wants, irrespective of what the rational part does, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So, I'm sorry, this is the last bit. If we could just play the video on the next page. So this video again is really interesting, as you will see, if we can play this one.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
Okay, thanks, that's great. So that's a really interesting thing, which again shows how we can be distracted and how our brains work in ways that we can't control. The funny thing about that is I obviously knew the gorilla illusion, and I was putting this into my talk, and I put it in and I didn't check it. And then the night before I first did this, I thought I should really check what that video is. And I watched it and I was like, yeah, that's good. And then it pointed out the curtains and the player leaving the game at the end. So I was like, just as susceptible as anyone else. So what we hopefully showed there through those videos, they're fun, is the way that our brain can be distracted, can be confused, and we can't really control what it's doing. And if you said to people, you're not going to see a gorilla in this thing walk past, or you're not going to see the curtain change colour or something, of course I will. I'm very rational. I can assess reality, but we're very easily distracted, and that's what we're hoping to show there. But it kind of gets worse because not only can we not control our brains, but our doctors can't control our brains. And so this is a fascinating study that was done in the States where they got a group of, what do they call them? Physicians in the States, that's the American term. And they presented them with a problem. And they said, you've got a patient who you've been working with for a number of months and you've just decided that they need a hip replacement. They've got a lot of pain and there's nothing that they can do about it. They need to go, and you've set them on what I think is called the treatment pathway. So you've started them and they're going to have the consultations, and in a few months they'll have the hip replacement, or however it works. But the thing is that you wake up late one night and you think, oh my goodness, I can't believe it. I've forgotten to try one drug. I forgot to try ibuprofen. This is terrible. And so you say to the physicians, you say, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to pull this person back and try the ibuprofen, or do you let them carry on with their treatment pathway to have their hip replaced, even though they may not need it because you didn't try ibuprofen to help them with their pain? You will be relieved to learn that the majority of physicians choose to pull the patient back and not have the invasive surgery. So far, so good. What's less comforting is that if you do this again, but you change it slightly and you say to them, well, you wake up in the middle of the night and actually you remember, oh my goodness, I forgot 2 drugs that I could try, ibuprofen and something else. Do you pull the patient back and try the 2 drugs, or do you allow them to carry on with the treatment? Now, rationally, it would make sense to pull the patient back because now you've got 2 chances to make them better, right? Twice as much. But unfortunately, the majority of doctors now allow the patient to carry on and have their hip replaced, which is slightly terrifying if you're contemplating a hip replacement. But if you think about it from a rational perspective, that makes 0 sense. We can all agree on that, right? Twice as much chance. But from an emotional perspective, it kind of makes perfect sense. Well, not perfect sense, but it's really complex, having to test 2 different things. And there's also that feeling of like, you really messed up there. Are you even qualified as a doctor? Let's just let this thing slide. Let's just let this thing go. That's easier. It's less complex. It's more straightforward. I'm just going to let this go. And obviously, we can't see into these people's heads and understand exactly why they're making those decisions. But when you remove rationality, suddenly it becomes quite clear why actually that might make sense to do that on a purely emotional level. So you'll never look at your doctor the same way again. That's a public service that I'm providing here. So what we're finding here is that there are these 2 parts of the brain, as I said before. Hands up again, anyone who knows Jonathan Haidt, author. Interesting guy again. If you're interested in this stuff, well worth reading. He talks about the elephant and the rider. And hopefully that analogy makes some intuitive sense. You've got the rider, which is the rational part of your brain, which is trying to dictate the way that things go. And the rider likes to think that the rider is in control. The rider likes to think that if the rider says that A and B are the same color, then the elephant will obey. But the elephant doesn't. The elephant does whatever it damn well pleases. Quite frankly. And we see that, most obviously with things like the visual illusions, where even if you're told that the dress is white and gold, if you see it as blue and black, you cannot override the elephant. The rider can scream at the elephant, but the elephant is going to do what it wants. And we see it with doctors and any other number of illustrations that I could give. So I want to start to talk about how this plays out in decision making a bit more. We've looked at doctors, but I want to go a little bit deeper. So I want to talk about a guy, fascinating guy, who was around in the 1830s, 1840s, and slightly beyond. A guy called Phineas Gage, and he's really interesting for a number of reasons. So his story is that he was a railroad worker in the States, and he was unfortunate. I think in 1838, unfortunate enough to have a 38-inch iron spike up through his eye, which I imagine was rather painful. So he's fascinating for a number of reasons. Number one, he survived, despite losing a large chunk of his brain. And number 2, because he survived, physicians and people were able to examine his behavior and how it changed. And this is where we got our first insight into how decision-making is affected by emotion. So 2 very interesting things happened to Phineas Gage beyond the spike, which was that he became very rude and unable to relate to other people. So, he had absolutely no sense of, proper manners or how to treat people, very abrasive, very difficult to get on with, essentially a completely different person to who he was before. So his emotional side was severely impacted. His ability to empathize and sympathize and all these things were completely shot, which is understandable when you've had a massive spike through your brain and huge brain damage. But the other thing that happened in parallel with that was that he became incredibly indecisive. So he couldn't make a decision. He couldn't agree on a plan and head through. So the story is that he would he'd think of something and he'd talk about it obsessively, and then just as quickly discard it and move on to the next idea. He was unable to fix on something and make a proper decision. And that was our first insight into the possible connection between emotions and decision making, because his emotional side was completely kind of ruined, as was his decision making through the same injury. We no longer, you'll be glad to hear, have to put metal spikes through people's eyes in order to determine this kind of thing, because we have things like the Iowa gambling task. And this is a really interesting experiment which was devised, I think, in about the 1960s. And it goes like this. You provide 4 decks of cards on a screen. It's done on computers now, obviously. And each card in the deck has a monetary value. So it could be minus $200, plus $50, minus $1,000, like whatever, everything in between, right? And you get unwitting victims, I suppose, and you ask them to play the cards. So pick cards from the decks, go through, pick. And the thing that the researchers don't tell the participants is that there are 2 good decks and there are 2 bad decks. And the good decks, if you play them long enough, you'll come out on top, right? So your results cumulatively over time will provide you with a win. The 2 bad decks will not. You'll lose over time if you play them. And unsurprisingly, what they find is that people gravitate towards the good decks, which is what you would expect, right? And away from the bad decks. And the interesting thing is that the researchers originally doing this experiment wondered why this would be. Can we attribute this to a particular brain function? And you might be tempted to think, well, there's some higher brain function, which is counting the value of the cards and working out over time, well, decks 1 and 3 did well for me, decks 3 and 4 did badly. Something like that. Not the case. When you strap electrodes to people's heads and get them to play this, what you find when they put their mouse over the bad decks, as if they're about to play a card, they experience a very, very strong stress reaction in the amygdala, which is part of your lizard brain, very fundamental part of the brain, part of your limbic system. And so it's actually fear of loss and anxiety towards playing cards from the bad decks which causes people to move away. It's not a higher brain function, it's not some mathematical counting thing, it's loss aversion and it's fear which drives people away from those decks. So from playing the cards, your brain is building up over time in your kind of gut, some people refer it to, an aversion to the bad decks and a kind of satisfaction with the good decks, which pushes you away from the bad ones and allows you to play the good ones. And the researchers actually went one step further and they said, well, let's try and prove conclusively that this is a function of the amygdala and nothing else. So what did they do? They went and found people who had damaged amygdala and they got them to play it. And what they found is that these people played the decks entirely indiscriminately, not gravitating towards the good ones, not gravitating away from the bad ones, just played completely straight across the whole thing. So we see here that this is due to emotion coming from the amygdala. And the point here is that all of this risk aversion, which drives so much of our behavior in this kind of decision making, is on our motherboard, because this is something that's evolved with us over time. For the same reason that people are typically afraid of things like spiders and crocodiles and snakes and things that move in that particular way. This isn't something that someone tells us, it's something that we just feel. We are afraid of these things for reasons that come from our biology, from our evolution. So now I want to bring this back to the original topic, which is to talk about risk and reward in B2C versus B2B. So if you're in a B2C context and you make a bad decision, what's the potential negative outcome? Maybe you have a bad lunch and you waste £5. Or maybe at the slightly higher end of the spectrum, maybe you buy a bad computer and maybe you can take it back, maybe you can't, like who knows. But in B2B, it's much different, because if you make a bad decision in B2B, maybe you lose your job. Maybe you get passed over for a promotion. Maybe you get ridiculed. Maybe no one takes you seriously anymore. Your career can take a really significant nosedive really quickly if you make a terrible decision in B2B, right? That's much more serious than in your B2C life, where you're just a consumer, right? Your impact is less. And if you make that bad decision, then it affects your life prospects. It affects your family. It affects your livelihood. It affects everything that you've worked so hard for. There's a huge amount of risk when we're making B2B decisions, right? But there's also a huge amount of potential reward. Because if you get these things right, then you can get promoted, you can get a pay rise, you can go up and up and up and up. And that's what we want, So these are very, very personal things. So surprise, surprise, people have looked at this, clever people with numbers and research, and they found that personal value, i.e. the kind of thing that I just spoke about, the ability to progress your career, to get paid more, to be recognized, to be respected, has twice the impact of business value on purchasing decisions. So these emotional factors, these things where, is it good for me? Is it good for how I feel about life? Is it good for my general prospects? In a personal sense, this has a twice effect of pure business value. the riskier the decision, this is interesting, the riskier the decision we need to make, the more we look for emotional connections. So I was going to put a graph up, but I thought that that would be slightly hypocritical in a talk about emotions in decision making. I thought that might undermine my point. But if you imagine two axes, one is risk up here, and one is level of trust required. It's a linear correlation between the two. And can anyone think why I might have put the IBM logo up here? Yeah. Sorry?
The whole thing IBM don't get sacked if you choose.
Exactly.
Nobody got sacked.
No one ever got fired for choosing IBM. A really powerful statement that everyone can make about IBM. And was it 40 years ago that this probably was, that this was really popular? We still talk about it today, and people still see IBM in a similar way, right? So the power of being trustworthy with people's risk is incredibly strong and perpetuates through the years. Again, 70% of people who see personal value in the decision will buy it, and they will pay a higher price, versus 22 and 8.5% respectively who don't see that personal value. So again, just more evidence on this thread. Who's doing it? So the great thing about this, about thinking this way and trying to act in this way, is that when it's done and when it's done well, you don't even realize that it's being done. And that's one of the reasons why it's hard to spot and why you have to point these examples out. So if you'd have sat me down 2 months ago and said, I'm going to show you a 6-minute video about printer security and you're going to enjoy it, I would not have believed you. And I don't think many people in this room would believe that this is even possible. But I watched the HP video. I don't know if people have seen it. I think it's called The Wolf or something like that with Christian Slater. Anyway, HP produced this video making a story around printer security. It's very emotive, it's very personal, it's very story-driven, it's completely B2B. But it's taken printers from being that thing that I shout at, and well, I don't shout because I'm not mad like that, but I get very frustrated at when it chews the paper up or when it won't print or when it's out of ink, into now I think of HP as an entirely different kind of brand, one that tells interesting stories and is about more than printers and has a wider perspective and means more than just that inanimate object that causes frustration. And I'd really encourage people to watch it because it's a really interesting video, and it will kind of demonstrate perfectly what I'm talking about. But a lot of big businesses do this. This is where all of the focus is, and we see this. Okay, other slide. Fine. Okay, let me rewind. So obviously these kinds of companies can afford to spend huge amounts of money getting Christian Slater into their videos and making these big budget productions. We in this room probably are not quite so fortunate, I imagine. But what we can do is we can really think about the experience that we give to our customers, because we have thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of interaction points every day. And what are we doing in those interactions to actually build that trust and to get people to trust us with the decisions that they need to make, which often carry significant risk in a B2B context. So this is something that we should focus on. And research by various people, or it is research, show that this is the way that the tide is turning. So 90% of Forbes Global 500 execs saying that experience is the new B2B battleground. Forbes and Gartner finding that experience will be the key differentiator in B2B. Forrester reporting a 6 times better cumulative annual growth rate for experience-focused businesses, and Forrester reporting improved experience is the top priority for 72% of businesses. And the reason for that is the fact that giving a good experience and relating to people in an emotional way, experience is a good way to do that, causes people to make the decisions that you want them to make, because you get them to trust you with their risk. So to talk about how we've seen this play out, predictably we help customers apply this kind of thinking to the content that they create. I want to give a few examples to make this a bit more tangible and real. So working with Willis Towers Watson, taking them from producing content in PDF, taking them away from that and producing it in a different way that offers a better experience, more interactive, more engaging, more enjoyable to work with, surfacing like huge numbers of leads that previously would have gone begging from people happy to give in their details, longer read times, better engagement, just a better result from the materials that they're creating. Working with Cisco, again, similar kind of approach, getting 5 times readership, because if you experience something and it's good and you had a good time with it, you're more likely to share it on, which increases your readership and so on. And deeper engagement levels for the same reason. A good experience, a high quality experience mean people engage more and they want to spend more time with you. Similar examples here, which I could go through, but I believe I'm short on time. Nice quote here from Tom. Putting clients' behavior and preferences at the center of what we're doing, we're creating more of what clients want and less of what they don't. And that's a great way to obviously engage with these people, build those relationships, which mean that you're really relating with them to them in an emotional way, and getting the benefits of everything that I've talked about previously. So to end then, I think just about on time, The key to taking advantage of this kind of thinking and this psychology and this research is to try and engage prospects emotionally. We need to build trust to overcome the perceived risk. We need to get people to be comfortable trusting us with their big decisions, in their businesses that, as I say, have these big personal consequences. And a great way to start thinking about that is by looking at the experience that we provide, because experiences are a great way to build that trust and understanding between you and the people that you're dealing with. So that's me done, I believe, unless I've got some extra slides. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was entertaining and somewhat informative. Thank you very much.